How are you?
Pretty good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Good.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. I loved your comment and so glad that you caught my video and that you've got some expertise and you want to wade in here.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I'm ready.
All right. Well, let's start with you because probably most folks don't know who you are. They have a better idea who I am, but you feel free to ask me any questions. So let a little bit of short summary, and then we'll dig into your story a little bit, and then get to your the work that you're doing on Jung and Peterson and all this stuff.
Sure. Sure. So, it's actually kind of a strange story. And so I hope you'll bear with me for a minute. It's going to take a minute to unpack it.
Hey, I do 2-hour conversations regularly. We got plenty of time. Take your time. Tell it well.
I think it'll be relevant to our later discussion. So I had a pretty normal child. So I grew up in a small town in North Arkansas. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a pizza delivery driver. So I didn't grow up in the lap of luxury, but we weren't too poor or anything like that. And I played sports growing up. I played baseball and football. Baseball was an important part of my life. And I had a good group of friends in high school. I went to a few of them went to college with me. I went to Arkansas Tech on an ACT scholarship, and I was in a fraternity there. And my point in telling you all of this is to say that my life up until I was 19 was very normal. I don't think anybody could have predicted what was going to happen next, and I definitely couldn't predict it. It sort of came out of nowhere, right? And so this is where the story gets a little strange. So after my first semester in college, I was home for winter break, and I had an anomalous experience. And I'm not going to go into detail about that, but in the course of this experience, I had a psychotic break. So I slipped into psychosis, and it was really bad. I ended up being hospitalized for a little bit. I was put on very high doses of antipsychotic medication, which only served to make me worse. I was, delusional and manic I was manic for a little bit, probably delusional for 4 or 5 months the first time. And I was unpleasant to be around during that time. And it was, it was hard on me, hard on the people around me. And but I kind of came back. So I wouldn't say that I recovered, but I stopped being actively delusional, let's say, after about 4 or 5 months. And I went back to school. I didn't do well when I went back. I was very confused and very distraught by what had happened to me. I sort of spent most of my time like playing video games and smoking weed and going to parties and stuff just to take my mind off of what had happened. And I ended up with a bunch of homework that I didn't do at the end of the semester. And so I went, right. I went around to all of my professors and I asked them if I could make up the homework, and they all said yes. And so I spent 2 or 3 nights staying up with Adderall and Red Bull doing all of this homework, and I did it all. And so you may be aware that psychosis and stimulants don't mix well. So I had another break, and so this one lasted 3 or 4 months. I left school at that point. I forfeited my scholarship and all that. And I also did something this time. I broadcasted my delusions on Facebook. So I had about 1,000 friends on Facebook at that point. So everybody who I knew in my life pretty much knew the contents of my madness, let's say. And I was very, whenever I recovered, I was very embarrassed by that, and it also sort of destroyed my social world because, I was sort of attached to my social life at that point. And so, because I would be around people who I knew, and some people were very friendly and nice, but some people made it clear that they didn't want me around. And I would also see people who I knew in Walmart and occasionally, and people who I'd known for years, people who I was friends with, and I would see them make a beeline away from me, right? So I was, persona non grata, right? And so anyways, after that, I moved down to Florida. My mom had moved down there. I moved in with her so I could go back to school. I went and got my associate's degree in philosophy. My GPA tanked because I did nothing but play video games and smoke all of this. I sort of receded into like my nihilistic hopelessness and despair, distracting myself from the tragedy of my life and all this, right? So anyway, to make a long story short, I skipped a year. Another year passed, and then I had another break. And then this one lasted again 3 or 4 months. I ended up moving back. So I had recreated my Facebook in that time. And then when I had this break, I did the same thing again. I broadcasted my delusions. And again, I'm very embarrassed by this, and it lasted 3 or 4 months again. Again, I sort of recovered, slipped into this nihilistic despair and confusion, I got a job at a resort, and I was sort of doing that. And I moved in with I moved back to Arkansas at this point and moved in with my grandmother, who was kind enough to take me in. And so that's where I was. And I was sort of living this life where I was working these jobs that I didn't like. And I was sort of playing video games and smoking weed all day, and just, you know, on the path to be a wretched and miserable loser is basically what I was. Right. And then it was probably, so I worked at that job for probably a year. It was probably 6 to 9 months after my previous episode where that's when I stumbled onto Jordan Peterson. And the first video that I saw was him yelling about free speech over a crowd of angry protesters, calling him Nazis and all that. And I thought it was interesting. I thought that, you know, he was an interesting individual. I mean, he was clearly had conviction, something that I didn't have. And, you know, that's always interesting. And I was always looking for content because I used to sort of fall asleep and play video games while listening to lectures and podcasts and stuff. The political stuff. So I was always skeptical of the motivations behind the woke ideology, but I was never really that involved, and I didn't really understand it. It didn't really matter that much to me. So, but I started watching his lectures, right? His Maps of Meaning and Personality and its transformation lectures, his class lectures. And in the course of watching those lectures, something clicked, you know, and the lights came on, and I started to put myself back together. And you know, I established a routine and established some discipline, and started to formulate my goals. And I went back to school. I went back to college for psychology, and I did very well when I went back. I ended up with like a 3.9 GPA the second time around, and I published a couple scientific papers as an undergraduate. And I got into my first choice PhD program, studying evolutionary psychology. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. I study evolutionary psychology. And the point is that I got better, and I didn't just get a little better. You know, I didn't really, it's not that I went back to baseline. I think I'm clearly better off now than I was before any of this happened. I'm on a better path now than I was before. And so I was very curious about all of this. I was very curious about what happened to me and what it was about what Jordan was doing that had this effect on me, right? Because I'm not alone in this, right? Because Jordan talks all the time, right? He gets
not alone in this at all.
Right. He gets letters and people coming up to him all the time, telling him some version of this story, right? They were in a dark place. They were in a pit. And through listening to his lectures, they were able to drag themselves out of the pit that they were in. And so I was very curious about this, and I wanted to understand what it was. I knew the sort of the concrete steps I had taken to put myself together, but I was sort of acting out the ideas before I understood them rationally, right? And so I read Maps of Meaning. I read Maps of Meaning probably a year into my return to my undergraduate studies. And the first time I read it, I didn't really get it. It's a complex and dense book and difficult. And I've sort of picked up bits and pieces here and there, but I didn't really see the whole, right? I didn't really see the big picture. And so I put it aside. I went back to my research that I was doing, and I ended up getting interested in something called the diametric model of autism and psychosis. And so this is just the idea that autism spectrum disorders and psychosis spectrum disorders are cognitive and genetic opposites. And in my research on this, I ended up sort of rediscovering the same pattern that Jordan was talking about in Maps of Meaning along the diametric model. And so I wanted to see if the connection that I was making was real. I actually started to write a book about this because I thought it was an important idea. And I think the diametric model is really important. But I wanted to see if the connection that I was making was real, and exactly what the connection was to what Jordan was doing in Maps of Meaning. So I read Maps of Meaning again. This was probably a year and a half after the first time I read it. And it's like all of the stuff that I had read in the meantime and the stuff that I was doing with the diametric model sort of set the context for it. And I'd read it before, so I knew the end at the beginning. And so the second time I read it, it really clicked. And I really saw the big picture and saw what Jordan was doing and why he was doing it. And I don't want to be dramatic here, okay? But I don't think it is dramatic to say.
Be dramatic. It's okay.
So I really think that what Jordan was doing in Maps of Meaning is of unfathomable importance. I think he was getting at something absolutely fundamental. I think the pattern that he was uncovering is, well, I mean, I think it's fundamental to everything, but we can get into that maybe later. But anyways, so the book that I was sort of kind of working on sort of morphed into this project where it's really an extension of the argument that Jordan made in Maps of Meaning. And I'm sort of extending it in both ways. I think that the pattern that he talked about plays out over biological evolution, over cultural history, and at smaller scales. So anyways, that's what I'm working on. I'm also working on my scientific research. I discovered you through John Vervaeke, by the way. So I've watched the Meaning Crisis series all the way through. It's fantastic. John is fantastic. I've gotten to talk to John a couple times. We're working on a project together. And so I followed you on Twitter because of him. And then I saw this video that you posted, and of course, so that's where I am. So anyways, that's where I've been. That's where I'm at. That's what I'm working on. I'll stop ranting now. So
no, rant's good. I like rant, and you rant well. So I hope we have more rants. So, okay. Someone on Twitter had sent me an article by someone who was talking about the, Peterson and Jung and archetypes. And you wrote, I thought, a really fine comment to that, response to it. Why don't you, because obviously you've looked into this deeply, and you've just shown me you have a capacity to explain. Why don't you sort of briefly lay out the argument of the relevancy of the argument of maps of meaning as you've sort of placed it before us now?
So I'll sort of put it in the context of the article and why I think the argument that the article was making was sort of off point. And so here's the idea, right? So we tell stories, right? Ever since we could talk, we've been telling stories about each other's behavior. And we also do rituals and stuff. But I'm going to focus on the story. I think that sort of simplifies it. And I'm going to focus on the hero story. We tell stories for other reasons. We tell stories when somebody does something stupid or malevolent or whatever. But the hero story seems pretty fundamental. And so, okay, so Ugg, the hunter-gatherer, finds a new way to kill a woolly mammoth. And we tell a story about him. He's the great hunter, right? And so somebody else figures out a new way to fish. We tell a story about that person, right? Somebody else brings down a despotic tyrant in the group. We tell a story. Okay, so we have all of these stories. And eventually there's too many stories for us to tell in one lifetime, too many stories for us to remember. And so we do something that human beings are very good at. We abstract out the general pattern, right? So we find the general pattern, and generally, the way that you do this with stories, it's sort of an intuitive process, right? So you have all these stories in your head, and then you have like an insight, right? It's sort of a flash. If you ever heard the story about how J.K. Rowling came up with Harry Potter, right? She sort of talks about it as this flash of insight. Well, I mean, that's what it is. It's sort of this intuitive and insightful process. And so we abstract out the general pattern and we tell that as a story, and it's a fiction, right? But it's not, it's not a fiction in the terms of being an untruth, right? It's not like it's not true. Jordan talks about it as being hyper true, right? Or meta true. It's the general pattern underlying all of these different behaviors. And so that happens over many thousands of years, right? Because then we have all of these fictions, and then we abstract out the general pattern from that. And then maybe there's a bunch of different tribes that have their little mythological narratives, and they come together into a civilization, and their narratives have to battle it out. And so that's another process of sort of finding the general pattern or finding the most true pattern. And so this happens over many thousands of years. And eventually you get this sort of hyper condensed narrative. And these are the mythologies that serve as the guiding narratives for the civilizations of the past, right? And so what Jordan was doing in Maps of Meaning, at least in part, what he was doing was he was sort of doing another round of abstraction, right? He was finding the general pattern in the mythologies, and he abstracted out this meta mythology, right? And so what does the meta mythology say? The meta mythology, it actually says, it's sort of two ways of looking at it, but I'll talk about one for now. The idea is that the mythological hero figure, the role of the mythological hero figure, which is our role as agents in the world, is to stand at the border between order and chaos, right? And this is sort of the most general pattern of let's say optimal behavior. Now, Jordan in Maps of Meaning, he connects this to neuroscience. So he connects it to the structure of the hemispheres, because the left hemisphere is basically specialized for order, for the known. The right hemisphere is basically specialized for chaos, for the unknown. He also connects it to the orienting response. And the basic idea is that so there's something about this meta mythology that's not just sort of out there in the narrative, right? It's actually grounded in our biology, right? And so there's something true about it. And so, it's not like this was unconscious in the people who are telling these stories, right? They were just telling compelling stories. They were just trying to find, it's not even like they were consciously trying to find, they were just finding the general pattern underlying these heroic behaviors. And the idea is that what they sort of stumbled upon through this process of abstraction is the optimal pattern of behavior, right? This is, and it's actually, we can go into some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in my book, but anyways, that's the idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very good. It's, you know, when we say this, it's always interesting to say, we say many thousands of years, and it's like, how many thousands of years? Because it's both more and less than we imagine, I think, sometimes. And it's also interesting. I like the way you articulated it, sort of in conjunction with a lot of what I've been thinking in terms of what human beings are and what we do and why we do this story thing together, where, you know, so somebody tells a story and another person hears that. And I think that's sort of what happens every time we hear a story is we sort of compare that to this implicit mental map we have of the world. And so then we alter it a little bit. And so we have this vast social process of recalibration, of just finely tuning these things. And I think you're exactly right. We don't know we're doing this. We just do this.
Just compelling, right?
Yeah. And I think Peterson, you know, I often liken Peterson, the way meaning functions in Peterson's system here is sort of like a gyroscope, because, and in some ways, that's analogous, a little bit different from Vervaeke's relevance realizations. So we're always working on this stuff. We're always tuning this stuff, and we're doing it in drama and literature in 3 dimensions in real time, and we're doing it over massive amounts of experience that are poured through genetics and poured through history and poured through geography and poured through, I mean, that's, you could, you know, lately what I've been thinking, if you think about the mass of humanity as some massive 3-dimensional computational computer, and in many ways the software is story, and we're continuing to rewrite the software as we're working on the software, and it's just this massive project that's happening. And what I, you know, where I came at this as a Christian minister was, you know, part of what happens in church is that we have this historical story, and part of what happened in history via, this gets into a little bit of theology, the modernist fundamentalist fight, which was sort of the continued process sort of launched by the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, the question of where does story and materiality, where do story and materiality really connect? Right. And of course, there's a huge bifurcation that happens in the modernist fundamentalist fight, where fundamentalists sort of take the ancient version, really their ancient version of the story, and that's where you get things like creation science, where you just kind of take Genesis and map that onto science, even though what we consider science today, that wasn't around when they were writing Genesis and when that story was emerging. And so I very quickly saw Peterson as being really helpful in trying to navigate this disconnect.
Yes.
And I think I'm so interested in your story too, because what you said knocks onto so many different things that I've been working on. I'll try and condense some of it. So I like my father, pastor a congregation in a low status area of town, which means that I work with a lot of people in group homes. I know a lot of schizophrenics, people with bipolar, people who aren't functioning very well, often in the kind of story you describe. So I have a fair amount of experience with people who are in and out of mental hospitals, so on and so forth, homeless people, substance abusers, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got a fair amount of experience with that, as my father did, because my father pastored a church in a very similar place. So I sort of grew up in that process. And so that's one hand of it. And then, you know, I see Jordan Peterson, I think, really trying to connect these worlds. Mm-hmm. And so then I make a video about that. And then I get a whole bunch of followers and people telling me the story you just laid out. I've talked to hundreds of people that have laid out basically the same story you did. And then I was invited to go to Australia, of all places, to kind of do a conference on my work, which was sort of crazy. And so what that forced me to do is kind of sit down and take a little assessment of what I had been doing. And so I had done just a lot of conversations with people who I made a commentary videos on Jordan Peterson's biblical studies. They found me, they wanted to have a conversation with me because I'm a pastor. You know, I do conversations with people, and pastors in some ways are curators of stories, which very much gets into your big thing. And so I look back on all of those conversations that I had, and I realized most of the people that I had spoken with had a story like yours. Many of them had been suffering. It's very common that many of the people that I've spoken with had been suffering from one form of depression or another. And they had, you know, gone to their medical doctor and maybe been put on antidepressants. And they ran through the whole medical regime to try and address their depression. And a lot of it didn't work. And then they found Jordan Peterson, and something happened in them. And they very quickly, almost obsessively began to devour Jordan Peterson's stuff, and especially, you know, the college lectures, and especially the biblical series. Mm-hmm. And what was amazing was they weren't depressed anymore. Mm-hmm. And I had to ask, I deal with a lot of people who are given a lot of psych drugs. And after a number of years of watching this thing go on, basically I came to the conclusion that a lot of this psychological pharmacology is trial and error. A doctor gives them something and waits a few months and says, "Are you any better?" Mm-hmm. And of course, the people he's talking to are living in group homes, and they're homeless people. And it's like, well, you think the rest of their life might have something to do with any of this? And of course, then the Jordan Peterson stuff comes around, and of course, Jung comes up, and I know nothing about Jung. And so I usually like to read a biography of sorts. So I start with his autobiography type thing. And he has this little story in there where he's a young doctor and he goes into a psych hospital, and the rest of the doctors say, "Don't bother talking to the patients because they're all nuts." And it's kind of like, well, isn't that why we're here, to try and help them? So he starts talking to the patients. And of course, then suddenly the stories and the individual stories and the big stories. And of course, Jung is the son of a pastor. And part of what pastors do, yes, we preach, but pastors are in many ways at this nexus point in this vast computational story machine. At least they have been for generations and generations. And so I began to watch all of these things come together, and it's like, there's something going on here. And a lot of the rest of the world, in terms of the doctors and the psychiatrists, don't really seem to be taking the rest of their patients seriously, and they're sort of treating them like a sack of chemicals.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is what's really made me so curious about this, because it's clear to me that whatever Jordan is doing, right, it has this ability to, strangely enough, as strange as it is, to heal people, right, of their illnesses, right. And look, it's been 6 years since my last episode, and I've been perfectly stable, emotionally and mentally stable ever since. And so, you know, I mean, it's just so strange to me, right? Because I know the trajectory of most people who have 3 psychotic episodes. It's homelessness, drug addiction, in and out of psychiatric institutions. And that could have, and as far as I'm concerned, I think that could have been me, right? I really do. And so, you know, it's like, what is it about this? Because yes, the drugs are a Band-Aid for a broken leg, as far as I can tell. I mean, that's what it looks like to me, especially antipsychotic medication. I've read the literature on the long-term efficacy, and it's not, there's no evidence for the long-term efficacy. It calms them down in the short term, makes them more manageable, but in the long term, it's not a healing drug, right? It's not like that. So we don't know how to deal with these things as a culture, I don't think. I mean, we really don't. And so whatever it is that Jordan is doing, and I don't want to see, the problem is that, you know, Jordan is embroiled in this political controversy, so it's become political. but that's not what it's about for me, right? I mean, that stuff's kind of peripheral. And I'm in agreement with him about the opposition to the Bill C-16 and stuff. I think he's made mistakes in that realm. He's said some silly things sometimes, or whatever. That, I'm willing to forgive the mistakes because I think the overwhelming good that he's done, right? So, but it's like, what is it, right? What is it about what he's doing that has this effect? I mean, this has been sort of the question that's driven me, and so. I don't have much more to say about it besides that. I mean, I can tell you, I can give you sort of an argument that I'm going to make in the book, and maybe it'll help. So I've talked about what Jordan did, right, in Maps of Meaning, and there's this idea. So this, and you also touched on something else, right? This Jordan is, involved in this project of trying to unite science and religion, right? And this, Piaget was doing this, Carl Jung was trying to do this, right? And this is really the direction that I'm headed as well, right? So, and this is one of those things, right? So there's this idea from statistical physics called self-organized criticality. And it was discovered by a physicist named Per Bach in the late 80s. And the idea is this, so Per Bach wrote a book called How Nature Works on the science of self-organized criticality. It's become popular in neuroscience because the brain displays signatures of self-organized criticality. John talks about it in the Meaning Crisis series a little bit, and he has a paper on flow where he thinks that self-organized criticality is essential to the flow state. Here's what it says. There are basically three states that a self-organizing system can be in. It can be in the ordered state, which is where it has a structure, but the structure is rigid and frozen and generally homogeneous. Per Bach in his book compares the ordered state to ice, so it's frozen. It can be in the chaotic state where the functioning of the parts of the system are uncorrelated with each other, and so the system tends to fly apart, and Per Bach compares this to a gas or a vapor. And the critical state is the phase transition between the ordered and the chaotic states. It's the narrow window between the ordered and the chaotic states. And the critical state, given some assumptions, the critical state is the optimal state for all biological systems, right? So, for example, genetic regulatory networks showed signatures of being self-organized critical. The brain, right? The brain actually, there's an argument that for most people during waking consciousness, they're actually slightly subcritical, and there's a reason for that. We can get to that here in a minute, but so there's obviously overlap between this idea and what Jordan was doing, right? The idea is that you can have too much order, you can have too much chaos, and where you want to be is in the middle. And so it could be superficial, right? It could be a coincidental overlap, but I don't think it is. I think so. There's this book by Alicia Yarrero called Dynamics in Action. And again, John Vervaeke talks about this in the Meaning Crisis series. He talks about this book. In that book, she makes the case that the only way to understand the behavior of a particular self-organizing system is in the form of a narrative. And it's a little more complicated than this, but it's basically because a self-organizing system's behavior is contingent on its past experiences and on its past decisions. So you have to know those experiences and decisions in the temporal order in which they occurred, if you want to get a grip on its behaviors now or on its intentions now. And so the idea that I'm putting forward is that, okay, if that's true, then if there is a structure to narrative, that structure ought to be the same as the structure of the behavior of self-organizing systems. And Jordan was extracting the structure of mythological narrative, and that structure is, for all intents and purposes, the same as the structure of the behavior of self-organizing systems. And so what this does, I think, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, but what it does, I think, is that it builds a bridge, because with self-organized criticality, there's actually a value judgment built into that idea, because there's nothing good about being in the ordered state. There's nothing good about being in the chaotic state. The critical state is good. And the fact is that value judgment is also the value judgment that Jordan extracted from the mythological narratives. And so this is a hard science theory, right? This is a theory from statistical physics. So the idea is that, look, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had this debate, and Sam was like, look, our values have to be grounded in facts. And Jordan's like, look, our values have to be grounded in tradition. And my hope is that, this, if I'm right about it, that this will satisfy both of those criteria, because those are good criteria as far as I'm concerned. So, because self-organized criticality, as far as I can tell, it seems to be as close to a scientific fact as we can get. So anyways, that's one of the arguments I'm going to make. Hopefully that was relevant, but.
Well, yeah, I see part of where my little YouTube journey has landed me is sort of in the middle of a lot of interesting places. because see, this is what I think disturbed Sam Harris, for example, about Jordan Peterson, which is that obviously for a whole bunch of historical reasons, the new atheist wanted to try to put to bed religion, as they called it. The difficulty that you have is that, you know, what you just laid out to me is pretty, it's not too hard to map basically the thesis of the, or the project of the Bible on what you just laid out, which again would stand to reason if what you laid out is true. And that, as we were talking, if you understand humanity to be this enormous three-dimensional liturgical dramatical computer, the answer we're trying to solve is, to a certain degree, what you just laid out. How does the world work? What is the story of the world? And I don't know if you've looked at all at, so another character to come into this thing was Jonathan Pageau, who is, I don't know if you've seen any of his videos. He's also been in conversation with Vervaeke. And of course, he's coming at it from a very different perspective because he's an icon carver.
Sure.
And I come at this as a Protestant clergy who has obviously had to study the Bible for most of my career because I'm a pastor, but also, unlike, let's say, an academic who is sort of studying the Bible as such, I'm always trying to work on the nexus between the Bible and this vast computing thing, which are normal people who have never heard of Carl Jung or Jordan Peterson or any of this mess, many of whom are, you know, some just sat down outside my door and are camping probably to smoke a joint, because people seem to like to smoke a joint right outside my door. And of course, the mapping of the story of the Bible is one way to understand it. It is the story of the reconciliation of heaven and earth. And earth very much maps on physicality, and heaven very much maps on ideation. This, what I think people struggle with is, okay, if we imagine humanity as this vast living computational thing where we're not processing zeros and ones, everything is happening in time and space, and the location of everything within that time and space spectrum is germane to the massive computation that is being underway. Now we're getting into, someone's going to immediately connect this to a simulation theory, and not a simulation in terms of computer games, but a simulation in terms of someone is trying to work out a problem, and we are all the parts of this vast computation. Well, what is the problem? Well, the problem is the reconciliation of heaven and earth, which is exactly the point of the Bible, where the Bible begins with this rupture between heaven and earth in Genesis 3, and it concludes with the reconciliation of heaven and earth in Revelation 21. And there's a whole lot of mess in between, just like our lives. And it's, I'm not saying that you can't find mappings in other religious or literature traditions, because if you contemplate that this is a massive, that existence as we know it is some massive computational thing working on a problem, then of course other traditions and places are going to be also working on the same problem. But then the questions are, what areas of the computer are making the most progress on the problem? Because then from an evolutionary point of view, by virtue of how the problem was laid out initially, over time, the process should begin to get closer and closer and closer to the answer. And then the scary thing for us who care about our little lives and our civilization and all the things we care about is what happens when the problem is solved? Right. What happens to us?
Yeah, so good question. Yeah. I mean, yeah, who knows, man? And yeah, I mean, as far as like who's made the most progress? I mean, that's a good question too, right? I mean, which narrative is canon or something like that, and who knows? I mean, I think that the Christ narrative is really important. It is you know, whatever Jesus Christ is, and I make no claims to know anything about that, okay, but I think it's clearly a symbol of this process, this death and rebirth process, because, you know, what Jordan laid out in the meta mythology. So I said that there were two ways to look at it, right? So there's this one idea, standing at the border between order and chaos. But what does it mean to stand at the border between order and chaos? Well, it means to enact this process, and this process is you establish order, you have order, an anomaly occurs, descent into chaos, reemergence into a higher order. Right? And this is the same thing as paradise lost, paradise regained, death or life, death, and rebirth. Right? It's the same thing. And so, and I heard Jonathan Pagiel say something the other day that I thought was really interesting about this. He talked about the fractal structure of narrative. So this is exactly what I think is going on. See, I think that this process plays out. So for one, over biological evolution, we have the idea of punctuated equilibrium, but the basic idea is that, you know, you have, let's say, an ecosystem or a system is in relative equilibrium, gradual change, things are changing, but they're changing gradually. All of a sudden, you know, maybe a species gets a mutation that makes it like a super predator, and it becomes extremely, you know, that's an anomaly in the ecosystem. And then what you have is an explosion of diversity, right? Sort of in response to that, new mutations get a chance to get a grip hold, right? And so as far as I'm concerned, this is the same process, right? It's order, descent into chaos. What you get in this is a controversial position, but there's a couple books about this. So John Stewart has a book called Evolution's Arrow, where he makes the case that there is a direction to evolution, and it's in the direction of increasing complexity. And Robert Wright has a book called Non-Zero, and he's making the same argument. I think Robert Wright's book is better, but they're both making basically the same argument. And the idea is that, so complexity can be thought of as increasing integration and simultaneous differentiation. So the idea is that you move towards larger conglomerates of like groups. So you move from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms, but then within the multicellular organism, you get increasing differentiation because things specialize. And that this is it's not, so Stephen Jay Gould thought that this was like a random walk because things only have one, but they're both making the argument that no, it's actually that these, the more complex entities are more adaptable. They're more evolvable and more adaptable and more flexible. And so they tend to survive through transformations, essentially. And so the idea is that, I don't even know where I was going with this one. I had a direction that I was headed, but anyway, so things get more complex over time. And actually, what's interesting about this is that Robert Wright likens this process, this direction, to the Logos. And I think it's right. I think that's right. Oh, here was my point. So what this means is that this process, the order, descent into chaos, reemergence into a higher order, right? There's a direction to that. It's not static. It's moving towards greater levels of complexity. Right. And the idea would be that by standing at the border between order and chaos, we are participating in that process. Right. And so if you want to use the term Logos, we're participating in the Logos. Right. And the idea would be that if you believe that life is better than non-life, that being is good, then that process is good, because right. That's the process that makes us more adaptable and evolvable and so on. So anyways, I'll stop ranting again.
No, ranting's good. You rant well, so don't apologize for ranting. But that very much addresses a lot of the elements of the conversation where, you know, it's been fascinating, the conversations that Jonathan Pageau and I have had with John Vervaeke, because obviously you have these elements in Christianity, not only in Christianity, but they are in Christianity, which is okay. There is progression. Christianity is a progressive religion, because, you know, you start in a garden and you end in a city. There's all these startings and endings, and all the way through, there's this idea that, well, there is something to be gained, and that there is a direction, and that the question of purpose is the question of purpose. Christianity basically says there is purpose. Purpose is there. Purpose can be seen. Purpose can be participated in. In fact, in many ways, the invitation implicit in the story is join the purpose. Get into the flow. pursue the meaning, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Because you tend to get this idea that expedience is sort of loss of momentum.
Yes.
Expedience is the unstriving. And I think, Peterson, it was what was amazing about especially that wave between 2016 and 2019 was just how many people sort of entered the stream, got into the flow. And we can use all these different words, and you can find words from other religious traditions that sort of map onto many of these words. But then, of course, we are small, anxious creatures. And so then we begin to get worried about all the things we worry about. What about humanity? What about me? What am I? Am I just merely a node in the network, merely a cog in the wheel? Or, and this of course is where you get into the question of individuality. And of course, Peterson is an ardent individualist, yet also, as Pageau, we are fractals too, because we have subpersonalities within us. Together, we form these larger personalities that get represented by Santa Claus or Uncle Sam, or, all of these things. And we participate in these, and it's really a phenomenal thing. And to me, it makes sense of what was in, Jordan sort of kicked off a lot of really interesting fights along the way. And the one person, so one of the things I started was a local meetup, because I very quickly realized that people wanted to talk about these things, but they didn't have anybody to talk to. Yes. And so I started a local meetup, and we gathered people. And so we've been sort of scaling that up online, but there is something germane about locality and physicality that isn't fully reproduced online. A lot can be done, but not the whole thing. And this to me gets into this question of, hierarchies of reality, that if you look at these dualities and these mappings of duality, order and chaos, we have all these dualities that form. And one of the critical ones is heaven and earth, which is, just for the sake of this conversation, say ideation and materiality. The optimal place between ideation and materiality seems to be, and it's right in the season for me as a preacher, incarnation, where the logos becomes flesh. And again, if you see this as the dominant mapping, suddenly in this story, Christ is right there at the goal of it. And so as these dualities sort of map on each other and progress and pile on, these things just seem to lay out. And I think a lot of people listen to Jordan. And part of the thing that drew me to this, of course, was, why are so many people becoming Christians after listening to Jordan Peterson, when Jordan says all the kinds of things he does about, well, believe in God, yada, 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 don't go to church, yada, yada, yada. But then all these people are becoming Christians. Like, why is that? And then when you begin to look at what he's saying and how this maps out, and again, people are picking up on this stuff intuitively, they're getting healed, their lives are getting healed. And even if we struggle to define the good in sort of a left-brained sort of way, we sort of know it in the right brain, and we can sense, not playing so many video games, and not drinking, not smoking so much pot, and not having, psychotic breaks every 2 or 3 years. That's good.
Yeah. And you can't deny, so when you have a situation like that, there's no relativism involved there. Like, you can't be a relativist. Not being there is good, and I'm willing to do what I got to do to not be there, right? And so that, it's kind of a sidebar, but suffering is like, suffering is its own value judgment. Like, you can't not value not suffering, and not making the people around you suffer and all that, right? It's sort of built into you. But you brought up a few good points there. So you talked about this hierarchy, and I think we're always sort of tinkering with the hierarchy, or at least we should be. And so here's an idea from Maps of Meaning, and it's related to Christianity, because, like I said, I think that Jesus, and I think that the mythological hero figure in general, is a representation of this process. Okay, now the idea is that we are a hierarchy of entities. We're also a hierarchy of beliefs and values, right? And so the question that you want to answer is what goes at the top, right? And also, maybe a question you want to answer is whether the hierarchy should exist at all, right? And so the idea here is that there is a correct answer to this, right? This is what Jordan would say, and that there are pathologies associated with the wrong answers. So here's one wrong answer, right? One wrong answer is to not have the hierarchy at all, and to put, this is a pathology of chaos, right? It's nihilism. It's nihilism, and it plays out, it can play out politically, and we may get to that too, but it plays out at the individual as nihilism, I think, in this idea that I don't believe in or value anything. And then the other wrong answer, let's say, you might call it fascism, although I think it's a little bit more broad than that, because I don't think it's necessarily associated with right-wing ideology, but it's rigidity, right? You have the hierarchy, and you're right. This hierarchy is correct, and it's not changing for anything, right? And this, this is the pathology of order, right? And so the idea is that what goes at the top of the hierarchy is the process by which the hierarchy is updated, and it's that process, right? It's that death and rebirth process, and what that means, to play it out, is what it means is that, well, sacrifice, obviously, because it is a sacrifice to sacrifice part of yourself in the name of a higher being, or in the name of a higher good, or in the name of truth. I would also say responsibility is important. Let me go into something. This is related, but a little bit of a sidebar. So, I talked a minute ago about this idea of self-organized criticality, and that it's the optimal place to be. But there's actually an argument that's made in the literature that it's not always optimal, because if things are sufficiently stable, if things are sufficiently static, you actually want to be tilted slightly towards order. And so the idea, but see, this is not the best long-term strategy, because you actually, that'll tilt you towards stability when what you want is meta-stability, stability through transformations. So the idea is that to get in the optimal place, you have to put yourself in a dynamic situation. You have to put yourself in a situation where things are not static and stable, right? And this will make it the optimal place to be is then standing at the border between order and chaos, this self-organized criticality idea. And so this is where responsibility comes in, right? Because what does it mean to take responsibility? Well, at least part of what it means is to identify a problem and say, that's mine, right? I'm going to solve that. I'm going to take on that load, right? And then that puts you in that dynamic situation, which, as Jordan would say, it calls forth, if we want to be dramatic about it, right? Jordan says it calls forth like the heroic ancestor, right? That the ancestral figure within you to, I love this clip. So Akira the Don has this, a music video called The Transcendence of Suffering, I think. And Jordan talks about this Nietzschean idea of, if you stare long enough into the abyss stares also into you, right? And then Jordan says, well, if you stare long enough into the abyss, past when the abyss stares into you, what you see is the great ancestral figures who you can incorporate into your identity. And what that means is that you have to confront the terror and the vulnerability of life in order to call forth the best in you. And that is putting yourself in these challenging and dynamic situations where you're confronting with the hardest problem that you can conceive of, right? And that's what it means to aim at the highest possible good, right? That I'm going to, do something that's important enough and meaningful enough to justify the tragedy and the suffering of my life, right? And this is the same idea, right? So this idea of responsibility, and see, I think part of what the Jesus story is like, here's what happens if you take on maximal responsibility, right? Here's what happens. You get betrayed and tortured and murdered. And that sounds very pessimistic, right? It sounds extremely pessimistic, but it's not the end of the story, right? Because he comes back, right? And so the idea is that, you don't get out of suffering. No matter what you do, you're going to suffer. But the idea is that if you take on enough responsibility, you can become strong enough to overcome it, right? That's the idea. And so that's what it means to enact and embody this process, right? To enact and embody the mythological hero figure. And so the idea of the hierarchy, right? That's what goes at the top. It's not a state. It's not a static state, and it's not belief, right? It's not like that. Because, it's not belief, because it's something that you act out and embody. It's not, John Vervaeke talks about, propositional and participatory. I think that this is at the level of participatory knowing. It's something that you participate in. It's something you enact and embody. And that's what's at the foundation. And see, to me, this is the idea that healed me, because, I'm somebody who was delusional, and, I'm not trying to be arrogant here, but I'm an intelligent person in some ways, and you cannot rely
a lot
on
of delusional people are, in my experience. I spend a lot of time with them. I listen to them, and it's like, there's a brain in there.
Right. And it's true. And of course, some people's delusions are group delusions. And of course you see that, intelligence is no safeguard against having silly and dysfunctional beliefs. And, it's really, and so it's not like that. It's not about ideas, right? It's about a way of being in the world, and it's about a mode of being. And so that's what's at the foundation, and that's what's at the top of the hierarchy. And so, yeah. So that's all I have to say about that. But that's sort of the idea.
And I think that's right, because again, this vast, again, I'm using a computer metaphor, but this vast computational engine that we are a part of is not purely ideation. The entire thing is, again, it's the union of heaven and earth. That's why, for example, in the Bible, even though evangelicals kind of, because of the Protestant Reformation, focus everything on belief, it's a really interesting thing to notice in the New Testament that one's destination to either participate in the banquet of the Lamb or to go out into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth is what you do, which, it's both what you do and also your relationship. So it is participatory. I want to come back to the suffering business, because I think, John Vervaeke, I think, quite nicely critiques Jordan in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis with respect to sort of the low resolution idea about suffering. And Jordan's point is a good one. Suffering seems to be the thing you cannot deny. I mean, because if you're suffering, and again, being a pastor, I deal with a lot of different suffering in a lot of people's lives. People have chronic pain. That's suffering. Jordan has just had an advanced course in suffering with the withdrawal from getting off the benzos. Suffering is a very interesting thing, but part of what we see in a lot of these stories is, one of the first things I got from Jordan is this high resolution, low resolution, using that metaphor that we have with JPEGs versus raw images, for example, that lately in my videos, I've been dealing with. So what happened we have a Discord server where we've sort of created a community, and it's interesting which theological issues tend to draw the attention of the people. And so I sort of watch that. And one of them is the question about hell in Christian theology, and noticing that hell took on a new label, which I hadn't heard before a year or so ago, of eternal conscious torment. And so, okay, hell is eternal conscious torment. So then what is Sam Harris's heaven, which, well-being? Okay, is that eternal conscious bliss? And we notice that when it comes to the hero's journey, every hero's journey must involve suffering. Yes. And so this, of course, is a deep problem that Christianity is always wrestling with: the problem of evil. C.S. Lewis wrote The Problem of Pain. And it's somehow suffering is always integral in this hero's journey. Jesus, of course, they take this phrase from the book of Isaiah. He is the man of sorrows. And if you look at Israel, anybody who reads the Bible and gets a sense of what being the chosen one involves, you're chosen to suffer. That's what God chooses you. And so a lot of people over the years have said, can you please choose someone else? Because if that is what suffering involves, I don't want it. But yet the suffering, and I really like what you did there when you talked about, okay, so it's not order and it's not chaos. Chaos is like, there's no hierarchy. There's no meaning. It's just chaos. Order is, it's rigid. It's lifeless. A rock has high order, but too much rigidity. And so one of the other fascinating things that I've thought about over these last couple of years is why is life so hard to define? You would think it being all over that someone could very quickly just have a definition of life, and it's remarkably difficult to define, just like all of these other very basic things that all of us have an immense amount of experience with. Yet, so I'm really enjoying what you're working on here. When, like where are you in this process? How is it being received? When are we going to see some fruits from this?
It's going to be a while. It's going to be a long while. So I'm like I'm about to start my second semester as a grad student. I'm not going to publish this for sure until I'm done as a PhD student. So, so that'll be close to 5 years from now, at least. So, and this is something, you've talked, I've heard you, I've kind of binge watched you over the past week, and I've heard you talk about the importance of patience and slowness. And yeah, so this is something I'm not rushing it at all. And these ideas are complicated, and I could get things wrong, and so I want to dig as deep as I can. And so anyway, it's going to be a while. So in the meantime, I'm going to be laying low. If this goes on YouTube, this will be my first foray into the public.
Now, according to you want me to post this, right? Because if you say I can't post this, this is going to be hard.
As of right now, I'm totally fine with you posting it. Yeah.
Okay, so. Good. Because I also know that people are going to want to talk to you after this video.
Oh,
because so? What I have, you've just in this video and really right at the beginning of this video, I think you demonstrated a real capacity to, in a very appreciable way, sum up what Jordan was doing in a way that a lot of other people can understand. Jordan is sort of like connecting up to the fire hose. And part of the thing is that fire hose kind of wails around and, is all over the place. And so, and it's kind of like John, it's probably won't mean too much to you. It's probably kind of like John Calvin and Martin Luther. Martin Luther comes on the scene and just explodes the world. And John Calvin comes by, the next generation and kind of looks at everything and, then we do a little bit of sifting here. It wasn't the, the explosion that created all the light, but it's like, I can understand what's happening here. And I think you laid this stuff out in a remarkably productive way. So I'm really excited about what you're doing and really excited about how you're integrating these things. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about it too. I mean, I like I said, I don't want to rush it, but and I can tell you a little bit more about the book and about another argument that I'm going to make in it. So, so I said that I think that this pattern sort of plays out over historical time as well. Alicia Guerrero is a philosopher. So she has so she wrote the book Dynamics in Action that I talked about earlier, and John Vervaeke talks about that book in his series. Ian McGilchrist, I think, has talked about her as well. Anyways, she has this idea that Western philosophy has been too focused on stability and stasis. And there's this idea in philosophy about process ontology. Right. So are things fundamentally substance, or are they fundamentally process? Meaning, are things fundamentally static and unchanging, or are they fundamentally flux and change?
Nouns or verbs?
Something. Yeah. So, and Alicia has said that Western philosophy has been tilted towards the side of substance and stasis and all this. And this is very concordant with what Ian McGilchrist has talked about, right? Because this is sort of the left hemisphere mode: maintain stability, maintain the current routine and structure, right? And Ian McGilchrist has talked about how the Western world is sort of has this left hemisphere bias, right? And what it looks like to me is that this is a process that's been going on since the advent of agriculture, because what agriculture did was effectively stabilize the environment. And as I said, when you're in a sufficiently stable environment, so there's actually this idea that what brought agriculture around was actually the stabilization of the climate. So before, and I guess they examine, like, ice, like Arctic ice and stuff, to figure out what the climate was like beforehand. But the idea was that, before 12,000 years ago, the climate was really fluctuating in a way that would not even be able to support agriculture. Then it stabilized. Somebody figured out that you can plant some food, or maybe they were already doing it a little bit. And then once one group does it, everybody has to do it, because they're just going to essentially conquer the world with this new technology. And so, but when you get agriculture and when you get the complexification of culture, it effectively stabilizes things, because, well, for a variety of reasons. I mean, if your grandfather was a farmer and your father was a farmer and you're a farmer and your kids are farmers, you don't have to change much generation to generation. And there's also this idea that if you're going to sacrifice the present for the future, the environment has to be sufficiently stable in order for you to do that. And so in order for us to really go about this process of like discovering the future and discovering this idea of sacrifice, right, the environment had to be sufficiently stable. And what it looks like to me is that the last 12,000 years, we've been riding this sort of wave of order. Despite our descents into chaos with the wars and famines and stuff, we've been really there's been more and more of a focus on order. And one of the exemplars of this, and I don't know how this is going to resonate with you as a pastor and a Christian and all this, but in Israel and in Greece, but I think the evidence in Israel is a little bit more clear. Jordan talks about how the God of the Old Testament was like a personification of the future, right? The God of the Old Testament is a harsh judge who demands sacrifice, and that's exactly what the future is like. So they were wrestling with this problem in Israel, right? They were wrestling with it. And there's this book called Did God Have a Wife? It was written by an Israeli archaeologist. And in Israel, his contention is that the folk religion, the religion of the people, sort of was really this sort of, he doesn't use the word shamanic, but it's really sort of a shamanic religion, more ecstatic, more pagan. Yep. And goddess worship was an important part of it. Yep. And it looks to me like and I'm not making any moral judgments about this. I'm not making any moral claims about this. I think this is a part of an ongoing process, and I'm not in the business of morally judging our ancestors, but it's very clear that the sort of elites within that society suppressed these pagan, the pagan worship, right, and suppressed the goddess worship. There's actually talk about Asherah in the Bible, right, and the suppression of Asherah. Well, I think this is emblematic. I'm not saying that there's a direct causal relation, but in Jordan's scheme, the Great Mother represents chaos, right? And so in their suppression of these sort of more ecstatic traditions, because at the same time, what was happening is that they were becoming literate. When you become literate, you get to write down your doctrine, and the more ecstatic shamanic traditions are a threat to that, right? So in the suppression of that, they also suppressed the goddess, and I think this is emblematic of the suppression of chaos, right? And I think that in Greece, there's some evidence that Minoan Crete was like a goddess worshiping culture, and then the Greek civilization kind of pushed that out, and the cults of Dionysus were sort of like a sort of the ongoing sort of the remains of that, right? But anyways, what we've seen is this: we've been riding this wave of order, and what happened when Nietzsche declared the death of God, right? What had happened was that we had become too rigid, too caught up in belief, too caught up in this, we know the truth. And then the scientific revolution came along, our contact with other cultures came along and wiped out the foundations, right? Wiped out the metaphysical foundations. And so, and this is what Nietzsche was talking about, right? And so we crashed into chaos. And there's this book called Madness and Modernism by Louis Sass. And he makes the case that modern and postmodern philosophy has a lot of overlap with schizophrenic modes of thinking. And he makes the case very well, as far as I'm concerned. It's convincing. And I'm not a scholar of modernist philosophy or anything like that, but he lays it out very convincingly. And so here's the idea, and this is somewhat personal to me, right? But the idea is that, look, what happens in psychosis is that you get your foundations knocked out, right? Something happens that makes your worldview that you held before no longer viable to you. And so the hypothesis, and this is a speculative hypothesis, okay? And so I'm being honest about that. I don't want to say that this is true or a fact, but this is a hypothesis, right? That what happened in our culture was akin to a sort of cultural psychosis. We lost our foundations. We descended into basically a cultural madness, and that Louis Sass was documenting this in his book. And so, I talked about the idea that what healed me, I think, was this idea that what goes at the top of the hierarchy is not anything static. It's the process that updates the hierarchy, right? And this affords metastability. It affords stability through transformation. So my hypothesis is that the same process that is played out in our culture, that this idea that has been healing to me might help our culture as well, right? That it might solve that problem as well. And so the idea is that we've been riding this wave of order. Either we're in chaos or we're on the way down at the moment, right? That's what it looks like. And see, I think that the chaos really is the technological revolution, because, now it's like every generation has a different set of problems than the previous generation. And you can no longer apply rules, right? Like if everything's stable all the time, you can come up with a set of rules and you can just follow those rules and things work out okay. But if things are always dynamic and changing generation to generation, you can't rely on rules. And I think this is why we're seeing a return of the wisdom traditions, right? People are getting interested in mindfulness. The rise of Jordan Peterson is a part of this. What John Vervaeke is doing is a part of this, right? People need wisdom because things are no longer static and stable, right? And when you're when you're in a dynamic situation and you can't rely on rules, the only thing you have to rely on is essentially wisdom, right? Knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. And I'm almost done. So, I don't think it's a coincidence either that in the Christian and Jewish traditions and in some other, the Greek tradition, wisdom is represented as feminine, right? I think that's the connection between wisdom and chaos, because I think when you're in a state of chaos, what you need is wisdom. When you're in a state of order, you can rely more on propositional knowledge, right? Things like that. But wisdom and chaos are intimately connected. And so the working title of the book is The Return of the Great Mother, right? So that's the working title of the book. We'll see if I stick with that. But because I think that we have seen a return of chaos and a return of the wisdom traditions, and perhaps a return of the West has, Alicia Guerrero has this idea about we've excluded basically chaos from our philosophy, but I think we've also excluded chaos from our cosmology, right? And the exclusion of the goddess, right? Maybe. So anyways, that's how I think this process plays out at the cultural historical level.
That makes sense. It's actually not far from a lot of what Jonathan Pageau has been talking about as well. There's some deep ironies in this because wisdom, so much of this has to do with respect to nouns and verbs. So a lot of, I think a lot of this you could find in, now obviously, if this is working through systems, you can find pieces of this working through different areas at the same time. And theologically, process theology sort of hit in the middle of the 20th century. And when I look at these processes that I watch now, and I'm not a theologian, I'm a pastor, but no, you need to know some theology in order to be a pastor. You can see how often these movements in the culture are often anticipated theologically, and they're anticipated by the artists, they're anticipated by the poets. And of course, in the Old Testament, the theologians were poets, back and forth. Part of what's happening, there's an irony in this, that wisdom is, a lot of this is a function of time. Wisdom, what do we do when we're working on wisdom? We look for very long patterns because we can't look ahead. We can only look behind. And I think your point is, in times of rapid transition or as we descend into chaos, where can we find knowledge? You tend to be able to find knowledge, as you say, in a wisdom tradition, because wisdom traditions preserve a lot more chaos, ironically, in the midst of their attempting to order it. And so think about, for example, a massive relocation of an ecosystem. Let's imagine, let's say oceans heating up. Well, where are you going to find what is wisdom like then in that picture? It's like these little microsystems that, because of rock formations or a volcanic vent or the way an island is, that, you know, certain elements of cold water are preserved, and so little animals get in there. And what wisdom does is basically is the massive compression of really where we started this conversation, of all of that chewing via story. It's chew, 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 chew. And so all of these little rules that in times of, Jonathan Pageau made this really excellent observation that part of what happened in the Second World War was, after the Second World War, and I think we saw this after the First World War as well, there was a sort of, you had this massive low, you know, wars tend to be accelerators, where, because they're just chaos, 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 chaos. After the war, there's this, you know, everybody, way too much chaos, that everybody gets very conservative for a while. Mm-hmm. And then in the 60s, you sort of got that out of our system, and then things starts to speed up again. And so, you know, we tend to go back and forth. But one of the things we don't realize often is that as individualists, we look at our lives and we think, oh, our lives are big things. No, our lives are really tiny things in this massive computer network. And so we might live during a war, which is an accelerating process, or we might live during the, you know, the bracing after the war, where, okay, well, let's go back to the old patterns and let's try to instantiate the old patterns. And so some things are brought back, but then those, you know, they're decaying, and okay, they're decaying. So then we go into another movement, and it's not linear in terms of steady. It's, you know, it's very spasmodic. And but it does go someplace. And so no, I think the way you laid it out, I really agree with it. And it's just way too, I'm going to have to listen to this video again, because the stuff you were laying out there, I thought were so compact, but is very much mapping onto all of these conversations that I'm having, you know, with Pageau, with Vervaeke. Of course, we're sort of downstream from Peterson. He sort of, you know, let out all that energy and helped us all find each other. And no, it was very good. It was very, very good.
Thanks. So, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'd be interested in talking to other people about this too. Them. I mean, I've you know, obviously I've binge watched John Vervaeke stuff. I'd say I know that John has this sort of argument against the idea of a narrative order. Yeah. And see, I think that this is actually, so given that I understand his argument, he basically said that the thing about a narrative is that they're finite games. And so if I have an endpoint, if my group has an endpoint and your group has an endpoint and they're different, the only thing we can do is go to war, right? See, the thing about this, I think, is that it's not a finite game because the endpoint is not a state. Right? The endpoint is not a static state, it's a process. And so it never ends, right? What you're aiming at fundamentally is not to find a static utopia. It is the ongoing enactment of this process. And you don't know where it's going to head, right? You don't know ahead of time. And so this gets into the idea of teleology, right? And so is this a teleological thing? Well, that's a little confusing too, because, you know, the Aristotelian version of teleology is about being drawn towards a particular state. It's not being drawn into a process, it's being drawn to, but this is being drawn into a process. And, you know, teleological explanations are often presented as being in contradiction to bottom-up explanations. But see, I view this as, it's sort of like this process is an attractor and a dynamical system. So if you watched John's stuff, he talks about dynamical systems theory. That's sort of the way I think about it. I hope that's a good analogy. I think it is. But so the idea is that, you know, we are being pulled into this process, sort of like a strange attractor, but we're being pulled into this process, but it's not in contradiction with the bottom up, right? The causal forces push, this pulls, but you're not being pulled into a particular state or anything like that. The details are uncertain, right? What's certain is the process. What's, you know, and it's, you know, like I said, I mean, it's sort of like, this is the most fundamental belief and it's the most fundamental value, right? It's what you can put your hat on, right? And so, and it's not really a belief, like I said, but you can put it in conceptual form. So anyway, and then, you know, you brought up this idea about the individual and about the, you know, what is the role of the individual. And, you know, I do think that I do think that individuals have a greater impact than we can understand. You know, I mean, it seems to me that if you know, I mean, Jordan has said this before, and again, in his fashion, in his somewhat dramatic fashion, that the fate of the cosmos is in your hands, right? And it's hard to understand how the fate of the cosmos could be in everybody's hands, but he says that's the way it looks to him, and that is I think that is the way it looks, because, you know, if you spend 5 or 10 years putting yourself together, you are inevitably going to become a force in the world, right? Hopefully a force for good, but it's inevitable, right? And you are going to have an impact, and you never know what that impact is going to be, right? And even if it's just, I mean, even if you're just putting yourself together to become a parent, to become a good parent, right? And as far as I'm concerned, you know, you hear this all the time when people tell their stories, right? About this one person who didn't know it, but like they had this impact on their life because they did this, you know, because they're fundamentally because they take responsibility, right? Like, you know, my grandmother is like this, right? I mean, she took me in when I was at my lowest and was kind and provided stability and all this. And, you know, she's not somebody who's going to solve, you know, the hard problem of consciousness, right? She's a banker, but, you know, it's like, if I do anything good in my life, it's because of her, right? If I do anything good in my life, it's because if it wasn't for her, I would have, you know, who knows where I'd be, right? And so, you know, it really does matter. It really does matter whether you get your act together as an individual and take responsibility and all of this. And so the individual, I do believe, is more powerful than, well, you know, some people don't even believe in the individual, right? I mean, some people think, you know, we're all just a representative of our group, right, or whatever, right? But, you know, I think the individual is far more powerful than we give credit for it. Of course, everybody, but then again, the same thing is true of, you know, we all as individuals rely on the people around us, right? And so that, you know, both are true, right? We are embedded in these networks of relationships that we rely on.
Well, I think that's right. And two things, again, back to the nouns and verbs. I mean, again, a lot of this has been anticipated theologically. There's open theism, you know, process theology. There's a lot of that. The difficulty that we have, I think, modernity, as Peterson nicely noted, you know, modernity was all about nouns, and so that for that stage, we're very much into nouns, and it's not that different from the developmental. I have 5 kids. I've watched these kids grow up. You have stages. For a while, you're working on verbs, and I think we're leaving a noun stage and getting into a verb stage, and we're going to be working on those things. But at the same time, too, the consciousness is a very funny thing, in that, so Solzhenitsyn rightly noted, we are all little centers of the universe.
Yes.
And, you know, Solzhenitsyn says that as an Orthodox Christian. And it's just a phenomenological observation. We are all little centers of the universe. My consciousness centers on me. But very quickly, as you are in community with people, if you're in a marriage, if you're in a family, if you're in a neighborhood, if you're in a church, if you're in any substantive, productive community, you begin to realize that your consciousness is deeply tied to everyone else's consciousness. And if someone in that group is suffering, you suffer too. And it's, you know, it's, life is astoundingly, life is this astounding gift that as much as we try to exhaust it with our systems, we keep finding we cannot. And that is a very delightful and sometimes frustrating thing. And that's why, in fact, it has tremendous value, and it is a gift. And that is why each individual is worth more than we can know. And it's worth more than the car or the money or the stuff. And it's even worth more than certain achievements. And, you know, the wisdom traditions bear this out. Yet that also relativizes the value of an individual, because sometimes individuals sacrifice themselves for the group of the whole. I mean, there's so many of these things. You get to an answer and it's like, okay, there's the answer, but then there's this. That's just
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. I mean, what you said about, no system is ever complete, and one response to that is to say, well, let's just stop building systems, right? And the other response is to cling to the current system, right? And, I mean, of course, we're back to that. I mean, the idea is that, no, it's like the process itself is the solution, right? I mean, that's, and so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's all I have to say about it. But, and you're right. I mean, we are moving towards and this has been going on in the last century, right? So, I mean, I don't know, Alfred North Whitehead made process ontology or process philosophy very, very popular. And of course, I've never read him because it's so complicated and convoluted that I will not, I'm not going to dive into that. But, this idea that we're moving from, stasis to process, from, as you said, noun to verb. And I think that's the only solution, right? Because, I think there's two things that sort of have to happen, right? Because, in the first place, we have nukes and we have China down there doing their thing, and who knows where that's going to go. We could wipe ourselves out, and that would be the end of us, right? And the idea, in Robert Wright's book called Non-Zero, he talks about this ongoing process of increasing complexity, but it's a process of increasing scope of cooperative groups. And the idea is that, and he said something really interesting in there about the importance of communication to this, because in order for single-celled organisms to come together into a multicellular conglomerate, they have to find some way to sort of to put themselves going in the same direction. They have to communicate in some way. And the idea is that communication is vital to this process. And this ties to Jordan, right? Because Jordan's idea of the logos is that it is the process that produces true speech. And so, we are at a crossroads, it appears to me. We are at a crossroads, both because of our technological proliferation. I would say primarily because of the technological proliferation, because we have these weapons. We also are on the, if a tyranny like the Soviet Union ever came about again, it would be a technological tyranny that would, we'd be able to surveil everybody all the time. This is what China's trying to do, right?
Yep.
And so, we're either going to get our act together or things are going to go very badly. I mean, that's the way it looks to me. And
probably both.
Probably both, right?
That's usually the way it is. It's both.
Yeah. And, and maybe there's a period of chaos and something better emerges out of that, right? I mean, maybe that's it. But, this process that Robert Wright talks about of increasing sort of complexification, I mean, the idea is that as an individual, you contribute to that process. When you tell the truth, when you stand at the border between order and chaos, because, and this is, I'm going to go on a sidebar here again. So John Vervaeke has this paper on the flow state, right, on the cognitive science of the flow state. And this is one of the arguments I'm going to make in the book. So, I talked about, he talks about the importance of self-organized criticality to the flow state. It looks to me like the flow state is essentially the critical state, right? And he talks about the flow state as being this cascade of insights. So an insight, this is like Stephan and Dixon, 2009, they talk about how an insight is preceded by entropy, by an increase in entropy, followed by a rapid decrease in entropy. Okay, what is that? What is an entropy? Is chaos, essentially. An insight is this same pattern. It's a descent into chaos, an increase in entropy, and a reemergence into a higher order, right? Into a higher level of complexity. And when you're in the flow state, you're doing this. You're surfing these waves of order and chaos. And at the same time, you're becoming more complex as an individual. But the hypothesis that I would put forward is that when you're doing this, you're also contributing to the cultural complexity as well. Right. So you're working at multiple levels of analysis. And also interesting to this, so there's a paper by Carhart, Harris, and Friston, 2014. They make the case that the action of psilocybin is to bring the brain closer to the critical state. Now, this actually makes a lot of sense to me because Jordan in Maps of Meaning makes the case that the instinct of meaning is what keeps you at the border between order and chaos, right? That following meaning. Well, in the flow state, when you're in the flow state, whatever you're doing is deeply meaningful to you. It's self-evidently meaningful.
Yep.
And the psilocybin experience is the same way. It is intensely meaningful. Whatever else it is intensely meaningful. Yep. And this is, you know, I think this is why it has this transformative power for people, because what it does is it shows you what you could be like, or what your experience could be like if you were properly oriented. And then it's like, well, I have to be like, I want my experience to be like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. Now, of course, you can do too much and just be pure chaos, right? I mean, that happens. But anyways, that's sort of why I think it works. But anyway, so the idea is that, you know, I think that Jordan was right? That this idea of the instinct of meaning keeps you at the border between order and chaos, keeps you in the critical state, I think. And also by, you know, another principle I would put forward is that whatever the solution to our cultural problems is, it's not a top-down solution, right? It's not the imposition of an ideology. It's not going to be enforced by the state, right? It has to be a bottom-up solution. And so as best I can tell, what it has to be is many individuals getting their act together and solving problems within their own domains of competence, right? And not trying to, you know, change the socioeconomic structure of the world or whatever, right? This is, and so this is a bottom-up process. And so the idea is that when you are participating in this process, you're contributing to that, right? You're contributing to the bottom-up improvement of everything. And here's something else, right? Here's another hypothesis. And you're a pastor, so I'd be happy to hear what you think about this. Because, you know, John Vervaeke in his series talks about agape. And what agape is the love that makes another person into a person. Right. And so, you know, so I've talked about this process, and when you're enacting and embodying this process as an individual, you're enacting and you're embodying the heroic ancestor, right? The mythological hero figure. Well, what would it be to want to set it as a goal to see that process enacted in another individual? Yep. Right. Well, that looks to me a lot like agape. Right?
That's right.
Yes. Right. So, you know, it's the kind of love that you have for your kid. You don't want your kid to be a pathetic weakling, and you don't want them to be a purely obedient, you know, android or whatever. You want them to be a heroic individual who goes forth into the world and solves problems. Yep. Right. And so that's agapic love, as far as I can tell. And so.
Yep.
So the idea is,
go ahead.
The idea is that a culture that puts this process at the highest value is really what they're doing is they're putting agape as the highest value.
Yep.
That's the idea, right? And that's the metastable. That's the metastable culture, and it's bottom up, right? Because what you're doing is facilitating this process in the individuals.
That's right.
And that's my argument, anyways.
Yeah. I think it's you should read. If you look at my channel at all, you'll see the most recent book that I put out again and again and again is C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. Because it, you know, what you just laid out there, people keep asking Jonathan Pageau, because he's hierarchy. What's at the top of the hierarchy? Love. Well, in Greek, it's, you know, of course, C.S. Lewis has a book, The Four Loves, because there are, you know, at least four Greek words that talk about love. And there's a lot of debate about, you know, the lexical range of these words. But agape is this self-donating love that, it's a strange thing. And again, theologically, this works. So the Christ, the hero, gives his life for the unworthy followers. And then, you know, well, what does that mean? Well, then he leaves and his spirit comes. And then in the story, the disciples are a bunch of misfits and hapless until, of course, the spirit comes into them, and then, well, they are bold. But what is their pattern? Their pattern is like his pattern. And you're exactly right, that comes from below. And you can look at all sorts of historical things. I think, you know, part of the conversation I'm deeply within right now is the Protestant Reformation. In many ways, the Roman Catholic Church had gotten way too tyrannical and rigid. And what happens with the Protestant Reformation is now suddenly each individual is sort of the locus of faith. And so this was in response to a certain hardening of sacramentality. And you can take this idea that you just nicely laid out, and you can map that onto how many of the critical the critical episodes of history. You know, I know that there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety around, and for a whole lot of good reason. When I was, you know, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War because I'm about Jordan's age, and I remember the anxiety of nuclear annihilation and all of that. And I'll tell you, before it happened, nobody imagined that that story was going to end like it did, where you know, we lived our whole lives just sort of with our shoulder against the Eastern Bloc and NATO and everything, just holding this back. And it's almost like, you know, the pull the chair move in basketball, where whoop, they're gone and they imploded, and so, you know, there is deep hope in that finally, and again, this gets very theological very quickly, finally, evil is parasitic. It cannot create systems of its own. And this process, you know, I mean, C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors. After he wrote, you know, all, you know, he wrote some of the most accessible philosophy I know. But then he started writing children's books. Well, why? Well, if you read his children's books, it takes you into all kinds of medieval things. He was a close friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, who is, you know, one of the other critical authors of the 20th century. But then, you know, his vision of what comes after this story. Have you ever read the Chronicles of Narnia?
Maybe when I was a kid. I don't think so.
Yeah, you might want to, if you might want to take a look at them.
Sure.
But you know, the last battle, kind of the idea behind, okay, what happens after this? It's further up and further in. And so what he managed to capture, now it's New Narnia. So there's sort of, you have your noun, but there's motion in it. It's further up and further in. And so what we do is the promise of the age to come is, you know, it's deeply connected with this age, and biblically as well. The gains of this world are not lost on the next, but the losses of this world are turned, and that's that movement of suffering that happens in Christianity, where Christ must suffer so that something that can only be gained through suffering may be achieved. And that then is the process. And it's a tremendously hopeful and optimistic vision that affords strength for the suffering path.
Yeah.
And so, you know, all of this stuff, you know, we see it lay, you know, and Pageau does this so well. It lays itself out. And what you talked about in terms of this, you know, the flow state, you look at, and C.S. Lewis lays this out in his book, Miracles. You know, every mother calls her child into being through agapic sacrifice. That's how the child, and any child whose parent has not in some way put their own life on the altar so that their child could live, every child suffers when the parent doesn't give their life for this child. And what you see is that this is laid out again and again and again and again at all these different levels of analysis in nature. And then so if we imagine the world to be this vast, purposeful, almost three-dimensional computer that is working on the problem. Well, what problem? The unification of heaven and earth. You can articulate that problem in a lot of different ways. If that is in fact purposeful, and if it in fact is progressive and heads in a direction, well, that's an awfully optimistic observation that, first of all, of course, Christians have been doing this. Looking at this, it says it's hard to imagine this is simply the product of chaos. And if it isn't the product of chaos, then it's probably going in a good direction. And so for that reason, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient, because you can derive a degree of trust from the directionality of the process itself.
Yes. Yeah. And that's that's sort of how I conceptualize faith, because, faith is not, as far as I'm concerned, belief in things for which you have insufficient evidence, right? This is sort of the Sam Harris thing, right? So, but as far as I can tell, what faith is, you can't predict the future. Things are too complex. So you have to say, well, look, I'm going to, if I want to put it in the terms I've talked about before, I'm going to enact and embody this process. And I'm going to trust that whatever happens is the best possible outcome that could have happened, right? And so, yeah, and of course that involves telling the truth, right? And there's a good reason why you have to tell the truth in order to, and now I want to say something about this too. I mean, the worldview that I would put forward, and I think the worldview that Jordan puts forward, it's not moralistic. It's not looking down from on high and saying, I'm a good person, you should be more like me. So it's not about that, right? It's how do you live a good life, right? I'm not interested in being, not interested in being a good person, right? I'm interested in living a good life. And I know, right? And so people would say, well, does that make you hedonistic, right? And look, I've been down the impulsive pleasure-seeking road, okay? I know where that goes. No, right? It's like, no, it's like, if you want to live a good life, this is how you do it. And, I think that at the same time, I would not conceptualize it as being a good person. I think that a lot of times that's self-deception, right? Some of the times the people who are most convinced that they're good people are like, not, right? You know what I mean? But it's, you're not doing this because you want to be a moral person, right? You're doing this because you want to live a good life. And this is how, and you're going to suffer no matter what. And you might as well justify it. You might as well do something that is meaningful enough to justify it. And then if you do that, you make everything better. And this is what I believe. I think that, it's a crime, right? It's a moral crime. Again, I'm getting moralistic now, but I believe this. I think it's a moral crime not to fulfill your potential. Yeah. And because, and you fulfill your potential by enacting this process. And the reason why is because you make everything worse. You make your own experience worse. You make your family's life worse. You make your culture worse, right? And so if I were to get moralistic about it, that's what I would say, right? It's, and this is not like, it's not like you should do this, or it's something. It's just like, everything gets better when you put yourself together. Your life gets better. Your family's life gets better, and your culture gets better. So why not? Right? And the only reason why not, Jordan, I think, hits the nail on the head with this. I mean, one of the main reasons why not is resentment, right? The world has been unfair to me. Why should I do anything to make it better, or even my own experience better? Because I'm a son of a bitch too, right? And so why should I make anything better, right? And that's resentment, and right. And of course, and I think part of that is also, and this is tied up with resentment, is envy, because it seems to me that this idea, what Robert Wright puts forward in Non-Zero, right? So that's a play on the idea of a non-zero sum game,
right? And
the idea that I would put forward is that agape is a non-zero sum game, and the reason why is because if I facilitate this process in you, I benefit from all of your heroic endeavors. You're going to go out and solve problems. You're going to go out and cure diseases, or what, and I benefit from that. My family benefits from that. That's a non-zero sum game. Everybody benefits. But what's the obstacle, right? Well, one of the obstacles is envy, because if you go out there and solve problems, you're going to rise in status. People are just going to give you resources and status because you're so it's prestige, right? And so I do think that envy is a big obstacle to this, and it's real, right? Because envy is like built into us. I mean, it's an evolution. I mean, I'm a Darwinian through and through. I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I study evolution. I'm a Darwinian through and through. This obstacle is real as far as I'm concerned. See, evolutionists have this idea that there's two ways to climb up a hierarchy, right? You can choose dominance, which is where you just intimidate and force, you force your way up. And then the idea, the Piagetian idea, which Jordan Peterson talks about, is that a dominant strategy is unstable. You might get to the top, but you destabilize the hierarchy itself. And so the group can't compete.
Yep.
And then another strategy, the other strategy is prestige, right, which is competence. You vote, you get voted up the hierarchy. I would actually argue that there's another strategy, right? But it's not the strategy of climbing the hierarchy. It's a strategy of tearing down the people at the top to make yourself higher status. And I think that's the third strategy. And so you see these are,
Yep.
and
They're
I
all,
think
they're all in the news in front of us.
Right. You see this all the time, right? And I think these are related to the pathologies of order and chaos, because it looks to me like the pathology of order is related to dominance, right? It's related to this, we have this hierarchy. We're going to make sure that nothing can upend it, right? We're going to make sure it's stable, and it's a dominance hierarchy, right? It's top-down authority. And the pathology of chaos, the political pathology of chaos, looks to me that Jordan hit the nail on the head. It's equality of outcome. And because equality of outcome is where you take the hierarchy and you take the hierarchy and you flatten it out. And it's not just about people and income as well, because there's an ideological network which revolves around this, which also has equality of ideas, right? Epistemological relativism and cultural relativism, equality of values. So they're trying to flatten out all these hierarchies. And
it doesn't work. It can't work. So you say that's the best value. Yeah. So you've had a hierarchy. Okay. Stuff just doesn't work. You're kicking against the goads.
Yeah. I mean, well, like that's, the only outcome of that is the logical outcome of that is that nothing's left, right? I mean, you're just left with, you're left with nothing. And and I think that is what's sort of at the bottom. I mean, there are clearly political pathologies, and of course, one is fascism, the other is tear everything down, right? Burn it to the ground, right? And those are pathologies of order and chaos. But anyways, that's it.
Well, this has been delightful. Maybe that's a good place for us to end. I hope we get a chance to talk again, because this has been good. And like I said, are you on Twitter?
No, not really. I have an anonymous account that
okay, so we won't go there. So if people want to contact you, should I have them just contact me and I'll forward?
You can put my email.
Okay. Well, you were in the comment section on the previous video, so I'll post this in the next few days probably. So if you just show up there in the comment section, then people can find you, because I think I know a number of people who are probably going to want to have conversations with you, because one of the things that happened after I did my YouTube channel is more people started their own. And so we've been posting conversations and finding that to be helpful. So
cool. Yeah, that sounds good to me. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Brett. And we will be in touch, because I definitely will want to have more conversations with you.
Sounds good to me. All right.
Take care.
Cool. Yep.
Bye-bye.